She was already going still by the time he got his arms under her. Blood soaking dark through the burgundy of her gown, gold and crystal scattered across the marble like broken ice, and his hands were shaking before he even understood what he was looking at. Rebecca, on his knees on the ballroom floor, 300 guests frozen mid-scream around him, Han Jungi doing the one thing his family had spent 30 years training out of him, falling apart in public. "Stay with me," he said. Not smooth, not controlled, nothing like the man who ran board meetings without raising his voice. "Rebecca, stay with me, please." Her eyes found his, dark and unfocused, but still fighting to hold on, still trying to warn him even now, even crushed beneath the wreckage of a chandelier that was never supposed to fall. Her lips moved. He bent his ear to her mouth to catch it. "It didn't fall," she breathed. "Someone dropped it." And then, before her eyes slid shut, his head came up on instinct, scanning the chaos, and found her. Yuna, standing motionless at the edge of the room while everyone else ran, a small black remote, resting open in her palm like she wanted him to see it. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe now. This is where the deadliest kind of love story gets told all the way to the end. No shortcuts, no soft endings. I need you to understand who Rebecca Houston was before any of this happened, because 3 weeks earlier, she walked into the Han Grand Hotel asking a question nobody wanted answered. Comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see how far this story travels. And stay close, because by the end of this chapter, you'll find out exactly why Rebecca never trusted a chandelier that passed inspection. Seoul in early spring smelled like rain that hadn't decided to fall yet. And Rebecca Houston walked into the lobby of the Han Grand Hotel with a hard hat under one arm and a folder of renovation permits under the other, already annoyed that no one had emailed her the final structural sign-offs the way they'd promised. She'd flown 14 hours for this. She wasn't going to spend her first morning chasing paperwork that should have been sitting in her inbox before she'd even boarded the plane. The lobby itself was the kind of beautiful that was built to make people feel small. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, a 2-story wall of glass looking out over a private garden, and somewhere above her, hidden behind scaffolding and drop cloths, the ballroom that was the entire reason she was here. The Han Group didn't just want a renovated event space. They wanted a symbol, proof that the family's flagship hotel could rise from a decade of neglect and come back gleaming in time for a reopening gala that half of Seoul's business press had already started writing about. Rebecca's job was simple, on paper: walk the site, check the load calculations, the rigging certifications, the fire suppression clearances, sign her name to a document confirming that everything above the heads of the hundreds of guests who'd fill that ballroom in 3 weeks was as safe as the renovation company claimed it was. She'd done 100 inspections like this. She had never once walked into one and felt the skin on the back of her neck prickle before she'd even reached the freight elevator. It started small. A site coordinator named Mr. Bayek met her at the service entrance, all smiles and rehearsed enthusiasm, walking her through hallways still smelling of fresh paint and sawdust, talking about the imported Italian marble and the custom gold leafing like he was reciting a brochure. Rebecca let him talk. She was more interested in the folder he handed her, thick with permits and inspection certificates, all stamped, all signed, all appearing, at a glance, to be exactly what they should be. It was the ballroom itself that made her stop walking. The space was staggering, even half-finished. Soaring ceilings, a wall of arched windows that would flood the room with gold light come evening, and directly overhead, suspended on temporary rigging while workers made final adjustments, the chandelier. It was enormous, a cascade of gold branches and hand-cut crystal that had apparently been shipped in from Austria and reassembled piece by piece over 6 weeks. Someone had clearly spent a great deal of money making sure it looked like the most breathtaking thing in the room. Rebecca wasn't looking at how it looked. She was looking at how it hung. She pulled the rigging specifications from her folder, scanning line by line while Mr. Bayek hovered a few feet away, still talking about opening night. The documents called for a specific load-rated safety cable system, dual redundant lines, motorized release mechanism for cleaning access, everything certified to hold nearly 4 times the chandelier's actual weight. Standard, careful, exactly what she'd expect from a 5-star property that couldn't afford even the whisper of a liability claim. The problem was the paperwork described one system, and looking straight up through the scaffolding, she was fairly sure she was looking at another. "Has this rigging been changed since the last certified inspection?" she asked, keeping her voice light, professional, the tone she used when she wanted an honest answer instead of a defensive one. Mr. Black blinked. "Changed? No. This is all original to the renovation plan. Approved months ago." Rebecca said, and wrote something down in her notebook. Because in her experience, the fastest way to find out if something was wrong was to say nothing else at all and watch how uncomfortable the silence made people. It made Mr. Bayek very uncomfortable. She spent the rest of the morning walking the building floor by floor, checking fire doors, sprinkler heads, structural reinforcements in the east wing where an entire wall had been rebuilt to accommodate a new spa level. Everything else checked out clean, almost suspiciously clean, the kind of paperwork trail that had clearly been assembled by people who knew exactly what an inspector would be looking for, which was precisely why the ballroom bothered her so much. It was the one place where the file and the physical reality didn't quite line up, and in Rebecca's experience, the places where people were most careful to look prepared were usually the places hiding the thing they didn't want found. She was still turning it over in her head at 4 o'clock, standing at the base of the ballroom with her neck craned back, when a voice behind her, low even, carrying the particular kind of authority that came from never having to raise it, asked her exactly what she was doing standing under his chandelier with a clipboard and a frown. She turned around, already prepared to explain herself to some mid-level facilities manager. Instead, she found herself looking up. Because he was tall, and because something about the way he held himself made her feel like she should, at a man in a charcoal suit that fit him with the kind of precision that only came from a tailor who'd made his measurements a personal obsession. Dark hair, deliberately careful, not a strand out of place. A face that was handsome in the specific, controlled way of someone who had learned very early that being looked at came with the job, and had decided the safest response was to give people as little to look at as possible. "Hanjungi," he said, not quite a greeting, more a statement of fact, as though his name alone should answer any question she might have about why he was entitled to ask her questions on his own property. "I run this hotel. You're the engineer. Rebecca Houston," she said, and did not offer her hand, because he hadn't offered his, and she'd learned a long time ago that in rooms like this one, matching the coldness in front of her usually got better results than trying to warm it up. "I'm the structural consultant hired to certify your renovation before your reopening, which means, technically, I'm the person standing between you and a very expensive party happening under a chandelier that might not be rigged the way your paperwork says it is." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite alarm, more like the particular irritation of a man used to problems being solved before they reached him. "That chandelier has been inspected 3 times, structural, mechanical, and fire safety. I signed off on all 3 reports myself." "I'm sure you did," Rebecca said, glancing back up at the rigging. "I'm not questioning whether you signed something. I'm questioning whether what's up there matches what you signed." The silence that followed was longer than the one she'd used on Mr. Bayek that morning, and considerably colder. "You've been on site for 6 hours, Jungi said finally. "And in 6 hours I've already found something worth a conversation. Imagine what I'll find in 6 days." He looked at her for a moment, Really looked, the way people did when they were trying to decide if someone was a problem they could manage or a problem they couldn't. And then he said, with the flat, courteous finality of a man closing a meeting he hadn't wanted to have in the first place, "The rigging system has been triple-checked, Ms. Houston, by people considerably more familiar with this building than you are. I'd suggest you spend your time on the areas of the property you're actually here to inspect, and let my team handle the chandelier. The chandelier is directly over the heads of your guests," Rebecca said. "That makes it exactly the area I'm here to inspect." He didn't answer that. He simply gave her a short nod that felt more like a door closing than an acknowledgement, and walked away across the marble floor with the unhurried certainty of a man who was used to conversations ending the moment he decided they should. Rebecca watched him go, jaw tight, already mentally drafting the section of her report where she'd note that the vice-chairman himself had personally waved off a rigging discrepancy without offering a single technical explanation for it. It wasn't the kind of thing that made her trust a building. It was exactly the kind of thing that made her want to come back after everyone else had gone home, which was precisely what she did 4 nights later. It was past 11 when she badged herself back into the ballroom, the rest of the hotel quiet, except for the hum of the HVAC system and the distant clatter of a kitchen crew somewhere below prepping for the next morning. She'd told the night security guard she needed to finish a lighting sightline assessment before the final report was due, which was true enough that he hadn't questioned it, and she'd brought a headlamp, a camera, and a folding ladder borrowed from the maintenance closet on the 3rd floor. The scaffolding around the chandelier had mostly come down by then, leaving the rigging exposed near the top of the vaulted ceiling, accessible from a narrow steel catwalk the renovation crew used for cleaning. Rebecca climbed it slowly, testing each rung until she was close enough to see the safety cable clearly for the first time. Her stomach dropped before her brain had even finished processing why. The documentation specified a redundant dual-cable system from a specific German manufacturer, rated for a load nearly 4 times the chandelier's total weight, with a secondary backup line built to catch the fixture even if the primary line failed completely. What she was looking at, run through the motorized release housing, was a single cable. Thinner, a different braid pattern entirely, stamped with a manufacturer's mark she didn't recognize, and definitely hadn't seen anywhere in the file. She photographed it from every angle she could manage on the catwalk, the stamp on the cable housing, the release mechanism, the anchor point where it connected to the ceiling truss, her hands moving fast and steady even as her pulse wasn't. This wasn't a contractor's shortcut or a supplier substitution buried in some footnote. This was a completely different system than the one that had been certified, installed sometime after the final inspection had already been signed off, which meant someone, at some point, had swapped out a piece of safety-critical rigging directly above where 300 people were going to be standing, and had done it quietly enough that it never made it into any report she'd been given. She climbed down, tucked the tablet into her bag, and told herself she'd deal with the implications of that in the morning, once she'd had coffee and slept on it and could think clearly about who exactly she was supposed to report this to, when the person who'd waved off her original concern was the same man whose name was on every one of those inspection sign-offs. The tablet was still in her bag when she left the ballroom that night. It was still in her bag when she locked her hotel room door behind her. And it was still in her bag, untouched, when she woke up the next morning and opened it to pull the photos into her report, only to find the folder empty. Not deleted with a trace, not moved, not corrupted. Simply gone, as though it had never existed. The file structure clean and untouched around the empty space where 23 photographs had been the night before. Rebecca sat very still on the edge of the hotel bed for a long moment, staring at the blank folder, running through every possible innocent explanation her mind could generate. A sync error, a corrupted cache, her own exhaustion making her misremember which device she'd used. And discarding every single one of them because she knew exactly what she'd photographed and exactly where she'd saved it, and empty folders didn't happen by accident to people who'd spent the last decade of their career being careful about exactly this kind of thing. Someone had been in her room, or in her tablet, or both, and whoever it was hadn't just wanted the photos gone. They'd wanted her to know it, wanted the clean, deliberate emptiness of that folder to sit in her stomach like a warning, because a careless thief would have wiped the whole device, and this had been surgical, precise, almost polite about it. If you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because Rebecca's about to find out this hotel is full of people watching her a lot more closely than she's watching them. She didn't tell anyone that morning. She dressed, went down to breakfast in the hotel's private dining room, reserved for consultants and senior staff, and spent the meal watching the room instead of eating, cataloguing faces, badges, the easy, practiced way the Han Group staff moved through spaces that clearly belonged to them. It was there, over a cup of coffee she barely touched, that she first noticed the woman. She was hard not to notice. Elegant in a way that seemed almost engineered, a cream silk blouse, hair pulled back with the kind of precision that took either a great deal of skill or a great deal of practice, moving through the dining room with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm like she belonged in every corner of the building at once. She wasn't wearing a staff badge, which was the first thing that caught Rebecca's attention, because everyone else in that room, from the executive assistants to the catering director, had one clipped visibly to their lapel. The second thing that caught her attention was where the woman was walking. Not toward the dining room's exit that led to the main lobby, but toward the service corridor that fed into the restricted mechanical levels, the same corridor Rebecca herself had needed special clearance from building management to access, the same level that housed the electrical systems for half the property, including, she was fairly sure, the motorized controls for the ballroom's chandelier rigging. Rebecca watched a security guard near the corridor entrance straighten slightly as the woman approached, watched him step aside without asking for credentials, watched the woman offer him a brief, easy smile before disappearing through the door like she'd walked that hallway 1,000 times before. It happened again 2 days later. The same woman. A different corridor, this time near the events team's staging offices where the gala's technical run sheets were kept, the woman moving with the same unhurried confidence, the same absence of a badge, the same effortless deference from every member of staff she passed. And on the third occasion, Rebecca finally saw who the woman was walking toward. Han Jungi was standing near the ballroom's east entrance, going over lighting plots with the events director. And when the woman appeared at the edge of the group, something in his posture changed before he'd even turned to look at her. A tightening through the shoulders, a stillness that hadn't been there a moment before. He excused himself from the conversation. The woman said something Rebecca couldn't hear, low and close, one hand resting briefly on his forearm in a gesture that was too familiar, too practiced to belong to a simple business acquaintance. Jungi didn't step back from it. He also didn't quite meet her eyes. Rebecca made a note of the exchange without fully understanding, yet why it mattered, filed it away next to the missing photographs and the mismatched cable, and the strange, hollow feeling that had settled into her chest since that night on the catwalk, and told herself she'd figure out the shape of it eventually. She always did. It took her one more week and a great deal of careful, casual conversation with the hotel's junior staff, the ones who talked freely because no one important had ever thought to tell them not to, before she had a name. Yuna. She ran an event planning and design firm the Han Group had kept on retainer for the better part of a year. Technically a vendor, practically something closer to a fixture, drifting through corridors most vendors would never be given clearance to enter, on a first-name basis with security guards who waved through actual Han Group executives with more scrutiny than they gave her. Rebecca brought it up carefully, the way she'd learned to bring up anything with Han Jungi, in the neutral, professional tone of someone simply reporting a fact rather than accusing anyone of anything, catching him alone in the corridor outside his office late one evening when the rest of the floor had already gone quiet. "There's a woman with hotel-wide access who doesn't wear a badge," she said. "I've seen her in 3 restricted corridors this week, including the one that houses the ballroom's rigging controls. I'd like to know who authorized that." Something in his face closed the moment the words left her mouth, the particular, deliberate stillness of a man who had been asked a question he'd hoped. Very specifically, no one would ever ask him. "Her name is Yuna," he said finally, and there was something careful in the way he said it, like he was choosing each word from a very small, very controlled set of options. "She runs an events firm. My family has used her services for the reopening." That doesn't explain the access. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that Rebecca thought he might simply walk away the way he had that first afternoon in the ballroom. Instead, he exhaled once, slow, and leaned back against the wall behind him, like something in his body had finally given up holding a particular shape. "She was my fiancée," he said. Before my father decided the family needed a different kind of alliance for the company, and ended it, and kept her firm on as a courtesy. A way of closing the door without making it look like anyone had been thrown out of the building. It was easier for everyone if it looked like nothing had happened at all. So her firm stayed on retainer. Her access never got revoked, because revoking it would have meant admitting there was ever a reason to give it to her in the first place. Rebecca stood very still, turning that over, feeling the shape of it settle into place beside everything else she'd already found. The swapped cable, the vanished photographs, a woman with unrestricted access to a building's most sensitive systems, and an unspoken history with the man now standing in front of her, visibly uncomfortable, visibly not telling her everything even now. "And nobody thought that was worth mentioning," she said quietly, "before I found a mismatched safety cable hanging over 300 people. Jungi didn't answer that either. He just looked at her, tired in a way she hadn't seen on him before. The polish finally cracked enough that she could see, underneath it, a man who'd spent a very long time managing problems by pretending they'd already been solved, and who was only now starting to understand that this particular one had never gone away at all. It had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right night to make itself known. If this story has its hooks in you already, don't scroll past without subscribing, because next chapter, Rebecca finds out exactly how far Yuna's retainer really reaches, and it's further than anyone in that building wants to admit. The invitation arrived on cream cardstock with the Han family seal pressed into the corner, and Rebecca almost laughed when the events coordinator slid it across the desk to her, because 2 weeks ago she'd been a stranger scanning cable ratings in a half-finished ballroom, and now she was apparently being seated at a private family dinner to meet the woman Han Jungi was supposed to marry. "Mr. Han specifically requested you attend," the coordinator said, in the careful tone of someone repeating an instruction she didn't fully understand herself. As the lead safety consultant, for the reopening briefing. It was a thin excuse, and everyone in that dining room would know it was a thin excuse the moment she walked in. But Rebecca had learned by now that when Han Jungi wanted something done quietly, he built himself just enough plausible cover to do it, and never explained further than that. She told herself she was going because there were still unresolved questions about the ballroom rigging that the family needed briefed on before the gala. She told herself that all the way up the private elevator to the Han family's dining suite on the 40th floor, and didn't entirely believe it by the time the doors opened. The room was exactly what she expected from people who'd spent generations deciding what beautiful was supposed to look like. Dark wood, low lighting, a table set with more forks than any meal required. Jungi's father sat at the head of it, silver-haired and watchful in the particular way of men who'd built empires by saying very little and noticing everything. Beside him sat a woman introduced simply as Director Han, his second wife, whose smile arrived and departed with mechanical precision. And across from an empty seat, clearly reserved for Rebecca, sat the reason for the entire evening, a young woman named Seo Yon, poised, lovely, dressed in pale blue silk, flanked by parents who radiated the specific, watchful pride of people evaluating a business merger disguised as a wedding. Jungi stood when Rebecca entered. It was a small thing, barely a beat longer than courtesy required, but she caught the flicker of relief in his eyes before he smoothed it away, like her arrival had changed the temperature of the room simply by existing. "Miss Houston," he said, formal, careful, performing for an audience that was already watching both of them far too closely. "Thank you for joining us. We're finalizing the last details before the reopening." "Of course," Rebecca said, taking the empty seat, aware of every eye at the table cataloguing her dress, her posture, the fact that she was American, that she was here at all, that the vice chairman of Han Group had personally requested the presence of his structural engineer at a dinner meant to formalize his engagement to someone else. Seo Yon, to her credit, was warmer than the room had any right to expect. She asked Rebecca real questions about her work, listened to the answers, laughed at something Rebecca said about the absurdity of Austrian crystal shipping logistics with what seemed like genuine amusement rather than performance. She wasn't the enemy here. Rebecca realized within the first 10 minutes. She was simply another person being maneuvered by people who'd decided, long before she'd had any say in it, exactly what shape her future was supposed to take. It was over the second course, somewhere between the abalone and the wagyu, that the door opened without anyone announcing it, and Yuna walked in. She was dressed for the room, dark green silk that caught the low light, portfolio tucked under one arm like a prop she carried everywhere, whether or not she needed it. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, her voice pitched perfectly for an audience, warm at the edges and cool underneath. "I have the final floor plan revisions for the gala. I thought the chairman would want to see them before tomorrow's press walkthrough." Nobody had invited her. Rebecca watched Jungi's father wave her toward an empty chair anyway, watched Director Han greet her with the easy familiarity of someone who'd stopped questioning her presence in this family's private rooms a long time ago, and understood, with a cold clarity, exactly how deep this went. Yuna wasn't tolerated at the margins of the Han family's life. She was woven into it, invited into rooms that should have closed to her the moment the engagement ended, treated by everyone at that table except Jungi himself as though nothing had ever changed. She took the seat beside Rebecca. Of course she did. "You must be the engineer everyone's talking about," Yuna said, turning toward her with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "I hear you've found quite a lot to be concerned about in my chandelier." "It's not your chandelier," Rebecca said pleasantly. "It's the hotel's. I just make sure it doesn't fall on anyone." Something flickered behind Yuna's expression, there and gone so fast that if Rebecca hadn't spent 2 weeks learning to read the small, controlled movements of powerful people's faces, she might have missed it entirely. "Of course," Yuna said. "We're all very grateful for your thoroughness. Jungi speaks so highly of your work." The way she said his name, no title, no distance, the easy familiarity of someone who'd used it for years and had never quite been told to stop, landed in the middle of the table like a stone dropped into still water. Seo Yon's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Jungi's jaw did something small and controlled, and he reached for his water glass instead of responding at all. For the rest of the dinner, Yuna was unfailingly polite, unfailingly warm, and every single thing she said to Rebecca carried a second meaning underneath the first, delivered with the kind of skill that meant no one else at the table would ever be able to prove it was there. She asked about Rebecca's flight home after the gala, phrased so casually it sounded like small talk, but Rebecca heard the real question underneath it clearly. "You're leaving soon. You don't belong here. None of this is yours to worry about." She complimented Rebecca's dress in a way that somehow made it sound borrowed. She reached across the table at one point to adjust the angle of a serving dish near Jungi's plate, a small domestic gesture, the kind of thing a wife might do without thinking. And Rebecca watched Jungi go rigid and say nothing at all. It was Yuna's eyes that told Rebecca everything the woman's mouth wouldn't. Every time the conversation drifted toward Rebecca and Jungi's working relationship, the late nights reviewing blueprints, the ballroom, the rigging investigation neither of them had fully explained to the family yet, Yuna's gaze would settle on Rebecca with a stillness that had nothing warm in it at all, proprietary and cold, the look of someone watching an intruder walk through rooms she still considered hers. Rebecca left that dinner with a headache and a certainty that had nothing to do with cable ratings. Whatever Yuna was to this family, vendor, ghost, unfinished business nobody had the courage to close the door on, she was not someone who had let go of Han Jungi, and she was not someone who was going to sit quietly and watch him let go of her. The 3 weeks between that dinner and the reopening gala moved faster than Rebecca could account for, filled with load tests and lighting rehearsals, and increasingly late nights spent with Jungi in his office, blueprints spread across his desk, the two of them working through the ballroom's original engineering files line by line, trying to trace exactly when and how the Chandelier's certified rigging had become the mismatched system she'd found on the catwalk. They didn't find an answer. What they found instead, slowly, was each other. In the quiet hours after midnight, when the polish came off both of them, in the easy silence that had replaced the early hostility, in the way Jungi had started, without either of them naming it, angling his schedule so their evenings ended together instead of apart. She told herself it didn't matter, given everything else at stake. She told herself that every night, and believed it a little less each time. The night of the gala, the Han Grand Hotel looked like something out of a dream someone had spent an enormous amount of money making real. Every window blazed gold, the garden strung with light, a red carpet stretching from the motor court to the lobby doors where cameras waited 3 deep for the first glimpse of the family that had spent a decade rebuilding its empire one careful decision at a time. Rebecca arrived in the burgundy gown she'd bought specifically for tonight, off the shoulder. Simple, the kind of dress that let her move if she needed to. Because some instinct she couldn't fully name had told her, the moment she'd tried it on, that tonight was not a night to wear anything that would slow her down. She spent the first hour of the party the way she'd spent most of the last 3 weeks, watching the ceiling. The ballroom was full by 9, 300 guests in black tie beneath the restored chandelier, its crystal catching the light from 100 different angles at once, breathtaking exactly the way it was designed to be. Rebecca moved through the crowd with a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking, positioning herself near the edge of the room with a clear sight line to the rigging, unable to fully release the tension she'd been carrying since that night on the catwalk, no matter how many times the mechanical team had assured her the system had been recertified. She saw Jungi across the room, moving through the crowd of investors and press with the practiced ease of a man born to exactly this kind of performance. Seo-yeon on his arm, his father a few steps behind, the whole family arranged like a tableau, built to reassure 300 of the city's most powerful people that the Han Group's future was as solid as the marble under their feet. She caught his eye once, briefly, across the room, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the gala at all. It was nearly 10 when the toasts began. Jungi's father spoke first, brief and measured, and then Jungi himself stepped forward to the small raised platform near the center of the room, directly beneath the chandelier, glass raised, the room settling into the particular hush that came before someone important was about to say something everyone would repeat tomorrow. Rebecca wasn't listening to the words, she was watching the ceiling, the way she'd been watching it all night, and it was pure instinct rather than conscious thought that made her catch the shudder. A faint, mechanical tremor running through the chandelier's central housing, barely visible, the kind of thing only someone who'd spent hours studying that exact rigging system would recognize as wrong. There wasn't time to shout a warning. There wasn't time to think at all. She was already moving, crossing the last few feet of marble floor at a dead run, and she hit Jungi with everything she had just as the housing above him gave way with a shriek of tearing metal, shoving him clear of the platform hard enough that he stumbled and fell out of the chandelier's shadow entirely. She wasn't fast enough to follow him out of it. The chandelier came down in a roar of shattering crystal and twisting gold, the sound swallowing every scream in the room beneath it. And the last thing Rebecca fully registered before the world went white and then very dark was the impossible weight of it catching her shoulder and driving her down into the marble, the burgundy silk of her dress already turning darker, wetter, spreading in a way that some distant, still functioning part of her brain recognized as very, very bad. The ballroom that had been full of music and champagne a moment before dissolved into chaos. Screaming, the frantic scrape of chairs, someone shouting for a doctor, someone else shouting for security, 300 of Seoul's most powerful people scrambling backward from the wreckage, while Han Jungi, who had never once in 35 years of careful, controlled living lost his composure in public, dropped to his knees beside her and started tearing at the twisted gold framework with his bare hands, sobbing her name like it was the only word he had left. If you're only just finding this story, don't wait for the next chapter to hit subscribe, because what happens in the next 60 seconds decides whether Han Jungi's entire family survives the fallout of tonight. The ambulance ride blurred into something Rebecca could barely reconstruct afterward. Fragments of white light and shouted vitals, and Jungi's hand locked around hers the entire way, refusing to let go even when the paramedics told him twice to give them room. Emergency surgery took just under 5 hours. Somewhere in the second hour, sitting in a hospital corridor still wearing a tuxedo, stained dark down the front, Jungi finally allowed himself to fully understand what she'd already told him on the ballroom floor before the world went dark around her. It didn't fall. Someone dropped it. And the moment he understood it, something in him went very still and very cold in a way that had nothing to do with grief anymore. He didn't wait for the surgeon. He called hotel security from the corridor outside the operating theatre and asked, in a voice so quiet the head of security would later describe it as more frightening than shouting, for every second of footage from the gala's security cameras delivered to his office within the hour. It took less than that. The Han Grand Hotel's surveillance system was, ironically, one of the things Rebecca herself had certified as flawless 3 weeks earlier. Dozens of cameras covering every angle of the ballroom, high enough resolution to read a name tag from across the room. Jungi sat alone in his office at 2 a.m, his father asleep somewhere upstairs, Seo-yeon and her parents long since sent home in stunned, uncomfortable silence, and began working backward through the footage from the moment of the collapse. The angle from the mezzanine camera showed the chandelier's release housing clearly, the mechanical tremor Rebecca had caught with her own eyes, visible on screen a full 2 seconds before the housing failed. He rewound further. 30 seconds before the collapse, the mezzanine level above the ballroom, closed to guests, accessible only through a service stairwell reserved for lighting and sound technicians, showed a figure standing in the shadowed alcove behind the ballroom's secondary chandelier controls, dressed in dark green silk that caught the light exactly once as she shifted her weight. Jungi's hand went still on the trackpad. He zoomed in, frame by frame, his own breathing the only sound in the empty office. And there, held low against her body but unmistakable once he knew to look for it, was a small black transmitter, a single button depressed beneath her thumb at the exact time stamp that matched the chandelier's mechanical failure to the second. Una hadn't run when the chandelier came down. He watched that part of the footage 3 times before he could make himself believe it. Watched her stand perfectly still in that alcove while the entire ballroom beneath her dissolved into screaming chaos. Watched her wait a full 20 seconds. Long enough to be certain of what she'd done, before finally, unhurriedly, descending the service stairwell and melting into the crowd of fleeing guests as though she'd been among them all along. He sat with that footage until the sky outside his office windows began to grey with dawn, feeling something in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, something colder and more final than grief. And when his phone finally buzzed with a message from the hospital telling him Rebecca had come through surgery and was stable, he closed his laptop, pressed his palms flat against his eyes for a long moment, and understood with total clarity that there was no version of the next few weeks that ended with him protecting his family's comfortable silence any longer. Rebecca woke 2 days later to a room full of white light and the low, steady beep of a monitor, her shoulder wrapped and aching in a way that told her, before she'd even fully opened her eyes, exactly how close it had been. Jungi was asleep in the chair beside her bed, still in the same shirt he'd been wearing the night of the gala, hollow-eyed and unshaven in a way that made him look, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely unguarded. He told her everything the moment she was strong enough to hear it, the footage, the transmitter, the 20 seconds Una had spent watching the wreckage before she walked calmly away from it. And Rebecca, propped against hospital pillows with an IV taped to the back of her hand, felt the pieces she'd been collecting for 3 weeks finally lock into a shape she'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to fully believe. "We need more than the footage," she said, once the shock of it had settled enough for her to think clearly. "Footage proved she was there. It doesn't prove premeditation. If this goes anywhere near the police, near the press, near your father, it needs to be airtight." It took another 8 days, most of them spent with Rebecca still recovering in a private hospital suite, a laptop propped against her uninjured side, while a hotel IT security specialist named Mr. Choi walked her through the building's access logs frame by frame, tracing the digital footprint Una had left across the property for the better part of a year. What they found was worse than either of them had expected. Una's vendor credentials, it turned out, had never been limited to the events team's staging, areas the way her contract technically specified. Someone, and the access logs made clear it hadn't been an oversight, but a deliberate, repeated override, had quietly expanded her building clearance 11 months earlier, granting her unsupervised entry to the mechanical and electrical levels that housed the ballroom's rigging controls, entry she'd used, according to the timestamps, on average twice a week for nearly a year, almost always late at night, almost always for durations far longer than any legitimate maintenance visit would require. The signal trace on the transmitter matched a small industrial remote purchased 8 months earlier through a shell account tied to Una's design firm, compatible with exactly the kind of motorized release mechanism installed in the ballroom's chandelier system, a mechanism Mr. Choi confirmed after cross-referencing the maintenance logs that had been quietly modified during a service window logged 3 weeks before Rebecca's arrival, the same window during which, according to the material invoices Rebecca finally tracked down, the original certified safety cable had been replaced with the mismatched one she'd found on the catwalk that night. The invoice for that replacement cable had been submitted through Una's firm, approved and paid without a second signature, buried inside a much larger line item for decorative rigging adjustments that no one further up the chain had ever thought to question. Rebecca sat with that timeline laid out across her hospital tray table and felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with her injury. This hadn't been a moment of jealousy that had spiraled out of control at a party. This had been planned for months, built patiently and quietly into the fabric of a renovation everyone else had trusted completely, waiting for exactly the right night, the biggest possible audience, the moment Han Jungi would be standing in front of the entire company with his future on display for everyone to see. She wasn't trying to hurt the company, Rebecca said quietly, looking up at Jungi, who'd gone very still beside her bed. She was trying to make sure that if she couldn't have you, nobody in that room ever got to see you happy with someone else. She wanted it public. She wanted everyone watching. Jungi didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it, and steadier. Then she's going to get exactly what she wanted, he said. Everyone watching. He held nothing back once the decision was made. 2 weeks after the gala, with Rebecca finally cleared to leave the hospital, arms still in a sling, Jungi called a meeting in the same ballroom where the chandelier had come down. Swept clean now, the wreckage removed, a temporary chandelier hung in its place, while the original crystal was still being inventoried as evidence. He invited his father. He invited the board. He invited, with a precision that made his intentions unmistakable, Yuna herself, framed as a final vendor debrief on the reopening's incident report, the kind of routine meeting she'd attended dozens of times before without a flicker of concern. She walked in wearing the same composed elegance she always wore, portfolio under her arm, and it took less than 30 seconds after the doors closed behind her for her expression to change, because the first thing on the screen behind Jungi wasn't an incident report at all. It was the mezzanine footage, time-stamped, unmistakable, her own figure standing motionless in the shadows with the transmitter held low against her side. "You don't need to say anything," Jungi told her, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, steady in a way that made every person present understand this was not a man improvising. "I have the footage. I have the purchase records for the transmitter. I have the maintenance logs showing exactly when the safety cable was swapped, and the invoice from your firm that paid for it. I have 11 months of access logs showing you in restricted areas of this building at hours no legitimate vendor would ever need to be there." Yuna's composure held for almost the entire length of that sentence, and then, all at once, it didn't. "Everything I did," she said, low and fierce, the warmth gone completely from her voice now. "I did because you were about to spend the rest of your life pretending none of it mattered. Pretending I never mattered. You were going to stand up in front of all these people and marry someone your father picked out of a spreadsheet, and let some American engineer you'd known for 3 weeks watch from the sidelines like it meant nothing. It didn't have to end the way it did," Jungi said quietly. "Whatever we were, whatever we could have talked about, honestly, like people who'd once meant something to each other. That door was still open, Yuna. You closed it yourself the moment you decided the answer was a woman nearly dying on that floor." His father, silent until that moment, rose slowly from his chair at the edge of the room, his face grey, with a fury that had clearly been building since the first frame of footage appeared on the screen, and it was he who finally gestured to hotel security waiting quietly by the doors, who finally said, in a voice that cracked with the particular horror of a man realizing exactly how much of his own carelessness had made this possible, that the police had already been called and were waiting downstairs. Yuna didn't fight it when security stepped forward. She simply looked at Jungi one last time, something unreadable passing across her face, and said nothing at all as they led her out through the same doors she'd walked through unquestioned 100 times before, her access finally, permanently revoked. The room stayed silent for a long moment after she was gone. Then Jungi turned to his father, and to the board members still seated around the table, and said, with a calm that Rebecca recognized now as the particular strength of a man who had finally stopped managing his life around other people's comfort, that the engagement to Seoyeon was over, effective immediately, and that whatever consequences the family wanted to attach to that decision, he'd accept every one of them, because he was done building his future out of arrangements other people had made for him in rooms he'd never been allowed to speak in. Nobody argued with him. After everything the footage had just shown them, nobody in that room had the standing left to try. It was nearly midnight 3 days later when Rebecca finally stood beside him on the hotel's rooftop terrace, her arm still in its sling, watching the last of the repair crews finish testing the ballroom's new lighting system 2 floors below, gold light spilling out across the garden, the way it had on the night everything had nearly ended. Jungi stood close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, just watched the hotel come back to life beneath them, floor by floor, window by window, as if the whole building were exhaling for the first time in a year. "I used to think managing a problem quietly was the same as solving it," he said finally, watching the lights below rather than looking at her. "I spent 35 years believing that. It took you nearly dying on that floor to teach me the difference." "I didn't nearly die to teach you a lesson," Rebecca said, though there was no real edge in it, just the tired, honest warmth of someone who had spent the last 3 weeks learning exactly how much this man's carefulness had cost both of them, and had decided somewhere in that hospital bed that she wanted to be there for whatever came after it. "No," he agreed, and finally turned to look at her, the last of that careful corporate distance gone from his face entirely. "But you did anyway, and I'm not interested in going back to managing my life quietly ever again." Below them, the last of the ballroom's chandeliers flickered on, gold light spreading across the marble floor where, weeks earlier, everything had nearly come apart. And for the first time since she'd walked into this hotel with nothing but a folder of permits and a bad feeling about a mismatched cable, Rebecca let herself believe that whatever came next for both of them, it wouldn't be built on something anyone had to hide. If this story kept you holding your breath from that first chandelier to the very last light turning on, subscribe right now, because the next case walking through these doors makes tonight look like the easy one, and you will not want to miss where it starts.